don't think I really need to do an introduction because anybody who's been coming to these programs for any length of time at all knows that we love the programs that Stuckey does. He researches so thoroughly and delivers with such wit. And what's another word? It's just really fun to listen to, very interesting, and you will remember these forever. Like we were talking about the Lincoln corpse. That was all about corpses too. Anyway, so without further ado, Stuckey.
Thank you. Welcome to the Mill Murders, a true tale of race, sex, and murder. Now that's a fact. Whether or not it is one of Bloomington's most notorious murders, I have no idea. I didn't do any research to prove that. But if you go to newspapers.com, you'll find that when this happened in 1946, before the internet, before cell phones, before the 24/7 news cycle, before TV, for pity's sakes, this story was covered in every one of the 48 states, plus the territories of Alaska and Hawaii. Now that makes it a pretty darn notorious murder, in my opinion. There was a time when there was a whole slew of out-of-town newspaper, wire service photographers and reporters that descended on Bloomington to cover this story from as far away as New York. But none of them had the experience of Rita Fitzpatrick, the ace crime reporter of the Chicago Tribune. Her editor told her to get down to Bloomington and cover the murder that has gone on there. So she hopped on a plane and flew to Bloomington and immediately went to the chief of police and said, "What can you tell me about this murder?" And only when he answered, "What murder?" did it dawn on her that she should have been in Bloomington, Indiana, and not Bloomington, Illinois. But she made it to Bloomington, Indiana. Our story begins on Friday, March 1st, 1946. We already know it's 1946. The March 1st is not important except to me. I was born 20 days later. And I took an avid interest in current events at an early age. But the important thing for you to remember, it was Friday. Don't forget that. And I will remind you of what day it is as we go along, because it was a fast-breaking story. On that Friday, Russell Kuntz was 43 years old, and he was not going to get any older. His wife, Ruth, was 45 years old. They'd been married 20 years. They had no children. They lived at 411 East University Street in Bloomington, a house that is still there, although the porch has been enclosed. He had been the superintendent of Sunday schools at the Clear Creek Christian Church, where I attended at some time during the mid-1950s. But currently, he is the director of the choir there. Now, for the past 17 years, he has worked at the Empire Stone Company, at their mill, and has worked his way up to be the superintendent of that mill. It no longer is a stone mill, and there you see a Google image where it is. There's what it looked like in 1923 about, and here's what it looked about 1940s. Today it is some sort of lumber processing facility. Now, I'm sure all of you are aware, but every time I speak on anything having to do with limestone, I have to remind you that the Empire Stone Company had absolutely nothing to do with the Empire State Building. Jeopardy got that wrong. The stone for the Empire State Building, we all know, came from the Perry Matthews and Buskirk Quarry just north of Oolitic. At the time, it was owned by the Indiana Limestone Company. There's the quarry that we all celebrate because the hole is still there where the Empire State Building came from. But it had nothing to do with the Empire Stone Company. Now, on that Friday, Russell Coons, just before noon, told Ben Smith, the company's sales manager, that he was going up to Hunter Valley and look around the abandoned Hunter Brothers Stone Company mill to check out some old derricks that they might want to buy. Now, I suspect that none of you are acquainted with the Hunter Valley Stone District. It was one of the major stone districts for many, many years. But you ought to know about it because you all drive right through it repeatedly. Well, the Brevet Brigadier General Hunter, who lived in Bloomington, who lived there, and in his home on North Kirkwood in Bloomington, which was torn down shortly after 1974. Bloomington's not big on historical preservation. But anyway, there's the Hunter Valley District, and you see the Hunter Brothers Mill up there, and you see that several companies quarried that area. There were several mills, lots of different quarries. It was, like I say, a major quarry area. But lo and behold, right on top of that quarry area, 46 and I-69 come together, and the majority of the grout piles and the quarry holes have all been filled in and leveled to where you can't tell that you're driving through a major quarry area. In the dead of winter, you can see some grout piles around, and you know they did quarry there, but it doesn't indicate just how important an area it was at the time. Well, the Hunter Stone Company was established in 1895 or 6, and they built a mill there in 1904. And there we see two views of it. They were taken about 1923. It had been abandoned about 1939. Well, that Friday afternoon, Lottie Finley, the secretary to Allen Buskirk, secretary treasurer of the Empire Stone Company, called Mrs. Coons and she said, just in case Russell does not come back to work, when he gets home, would you have him call the office because some business came up that needs his attention? She says, okay. Well, he didn't show up for supper, and that was so unlike him that his wife, Ruth, was just beside herself. And she called Ben Smith, the sales manager, when he was not home for supper, and Ben Smith called the sheriff. And you may be thinking, well, gee, isn't this awful soon to get all excited? Abandoned stone mills are dangerous places to be walking around, so he was quite concerned. At the time, our sheriff in Monroe County was Albert Skirvin. You may have figured out here that all the photographs on this program dating from the era come from newspapers, in which case they're not all that good, but it's the best we have. Well, Sheriff Skirvin and Allen Buskirk, secretary-treasurer, and Ben Smith, the sales manager, and Beatrice and Herschel Corbin, two deputies, piled in the sheriff's car about 8 p.m. and went out to the abandoned stone mill. And on March 1st at 8 o'clock, it's dark. I want to remember that. And we do have some pictures of the abandoned mill. There's the sludge pit where our bodies were found, and here's an even better picture of it. Well, when they got there, they found Russell Coons' Chrysler with the doors locked, and they looked in, and they saw a package of letters on the front seat and a box of chocolates and some business papers in the back seat. And when they began to look around the mill, they found what looked like there had been a scuffle. They found a little bit of blood. They found a woman's girdle. and her slip, and evidence that something had been dragged from where they located those out to the sludge pit, which was full of lumber, old lumber that had been thrown in and piled up. So the poor deputies, being the junior members of this search party, they had to jump in and start pulling out the lumber, looking around, and they came across a human leg and immediately knew they had found a dead body. And with that, Sheriff Skirvin called a halt and said, it's time to call the coroner. So presumably, he left somebody there to secure the area, and the rest of them piled into the car to go find a telephone to call the coroner. And on their way, they had a flat tire. And I'm sure the sheriff was thinking, this is going to be a long day. Now, I'm sure you're asking yourselves, well, why didn't he just use the radio in the police car to call the dispatcher and have him call the sheriff, or call the coroner? Well, they didn't have a radio. Radios were installed in police cars in the mid-1930s, and Monroe County law enforcement had them, but there had been a fire which wrecked the dispatcher's office with the equipment and all. So for several months in Monroe County, law enforcement could not communicate by radio. So while the sheriff was getting his tire fixed at a service station, he called the coroner. And the coroner came with several cars containing the coroner, the state, and other local police, as well as two brothers of Russell Coons and two brothers-in-law. Ray Borland was the coroner. I can remember him as a lad who was the school doctor when I was growing up. And now that the coroner's there and they could get in and remove all the lumber, they found, remember, a sludge pit. Sludge is opaque. You can't see anything in it. So once they got the lumber all off, it started extracting the body that they had found, and they suddenly found another body. So they knew there were two bodies there. The man had died of a massive blow to his head, and the woman had been strangled to death with a rope or a cord or something. Both bodies had had their hands and feet tied, but they weren't tied in the pit. And they were both gagged with portions of the slip. Well, immediately, the woman was recognized as Phyllis Coleman, 32 years old, married to Kenneth Coleman, age 35. They'd been married 10 years with no children. They knew that was her because everybody there, the brothers and brothers, they all went to the Clear Creek Christian Church, and she sang in the choir of the Clear Creek Christian Church. And she lived on a farm, and the house is still there. And that farm is located on Victor Pike, just a couple of hundred yards northwest of the Fluck Stone Company, which is now Texacone Stone Company. I grew up on a farm several miles north on Victor Pike. You're going to get tired of hearing about me in this program. Anyway, the Fluck Stone Company, ever since the Fluck brothers, and you have to be careful, as obviously ever since the Fluck brothers moved their stone mill from Chicago down to Monroe County in 1931, Lawrence County folks had grown accustomed to speaking about the Fluck Company and the family and all very carefully. So it was old school to them. Not the Indianapolis Star. Either the reporter or the editor or the typesetter, who knows what, decided that their readers simply were not ready for that. So they made it into Flex Mill, which Monroe County folks reading the Indianapolis Star must have gotten quite a chuckle when they read that and figure out what was going on. Well, the bodies were picked up by the Green and Herald ambulance, and Mrs. Coleman was taken to the Day Funeral Home and Mr. Coons to the Green and Herald Funeral Home. Now, it's getting quite late on Friday night, and if it was dark at 8 o'clock, I guarantee you it's dark by the time all this is going down. So, on Saturday morning, the police showed up in force to really give the area a thorough look around. Meanwhile, the leading suspect was Kenneth Coleman, who was a recent acquirer of a farm, but he had been a grocer, and that grocery is still there, although it's long since been a grocery, on West Kirkwood Avenue. It's an art gallery now. But here we are with the police on Saturday morning doing a thorough search. I already told you about that. Those packets of letters turned out to be love letters, primarily from Mr. Coots to Phyllis Coleman. And the prosecutor described them as mushy and of the high school freshman type. I am of the opinion that was a cheap shot. I think love letters between people in any situation in life probably have elements of mushy and high school type. But anyway, the contents of those letters were never released to the public because the prosecutor said they contained the names of other people. Well, so what? But anyway. Well, Phyllis Coleman had worked at the Johnson's Creamery for 10 years, is regarded as an excellent worker. And she left for lunch on Friday and never came back. There's the post office at 7th and North College. And it turned out, presumably they found out through reading the letters, that their trysts started out by meeting at the post office, which was just a 2-block walk from the creamery. Which struck me as a rather public place to meet, but even though Kenneth Coleman was the leading suspect, very quickly he provided an ironclad alibi because he had a lot of witnesses working on his farm that Friday afternoon. However, the Indianapolis Star quoted him as putting up hay. Now, anybody in southern Indiana knows you do not put up hay on March 1st. That's right. The first hay crop is Memorial Day. Other newspapers, they said that he was pitching hay, but didn't quote him. Well, he could have been feeding animals with hay. It's not important. Whatever he was doing on his farm, he was doing it with other people who provided him with the alibi. So he was off the hook. In addition, when they looked around in the light of day in the mill, they found his hat and a red handkerchief. There's the sheriff. I don't know what he's doing there, but he's doing it. The most important thing they found at the scene were footprints. There were footprints that clearly showed a boot with a distinctive mark in the heel that made it unique. If they found those boots, they knew they had their man. Now here we're actually comparing the boot to them. Now at this point, I'm reminded of the old joke that pick a group you want to make fun of, and you say, how many of these does it take to change a light bulb? How many police does it take to pour plaster casts of a footprint? But with all this to do, and rightly so, with the importance of these footprints and the plaster casts and their uniqueness, if I were Sherlock Holmes or William Shakespeare, I would say the game's afoot. But I won't say that. Then either the prosecutor or the police or somebody did what I think is an incredibly stupid thing. I would have kept the fact that there was a unique foot there secret for a while, played it close to my vest, and then only bring out that publicly if we needed. But no, it was in the papers that Saturday, and then on Sunday. And any murderer who was worth his salt, who read the newspapers, would say to himself, oh shit. That's the way murderers generally talk. I got to get rid of those boots. But apparently, our murderer did not read newspapers. Enter our hero, Carl Burks, 37 years old, worked for the Kerr and Riley Company selling Filter Queen vacuum cleaners. On Saturday night, Burks was reading the newspaper that his sister-in-law, Mrs. Harold Snooks, had brought him, and she related that her husband had pulled a truck out of the mud on Bean Blossom Road, and there were 2 Negroes involved, and one of them was wearing boots. Well, he knew the deputy sheriff, Noble Cisco, and he said, I need to tell him about that. But I'd go tell him this evening, but my car's headlights don't work. And presumably they did not have a telephone. So it had to wait till Sunday morning. Now, I wish what I told you is the gospel truth. But newspapers were all over the place in describing how Burks got that information to the police. Some newspapers said it wasn't his sister-in-law, it was his wife. Some had a truck wreck where the truck was completely overturned. Lots of newspapers simply said they received a tip, and without describing how it happened. But obviously, Mr. Lukes had something to do with it, because he wouldn't have got his picture taken with the boot. That's Mr. Lukes on the right, the sheriff on the left, and there's Jesus in the middle. Consulting about this. So now it's Sunday morning. And Mr. Lukes, the Deputy Cisco, and State Trooper Hal Hogbrook went to the scene of where the truck had gotten stuck in the mud. And sure enough, they found the footprints with the mark in the heel. Well, they found the same marks, which led them to the home of Mr. Snooks, and he told them about the 2 men and their truckload of chitterlings. Now, don't go to your iPads. I did it for you. I didn't know either. Chitterlings are pig intestines that are used for food. And he said that they had gotten those from the Bloomington packing house, where they sometimes worked. And he knew them. They were brothers. So Carl went home, but the Trooper Rayburn and the deputy sheriff went to the slaughterhouse and determined that the Woolridge brothers had on occasion bought chitterlings. Those 2 fellows were Chester, known as Cy Woolridge, and his younger brother, Joseph Luther Woolridge Jr., known as Luther Woolridge. They took both of them in custody, but quickly determined that Cy Woolridge had been in Indianapolis the whole day Friday. But he was not given the courtesy of being released like Mr. Coleman was. He had to stay in jail till Monday morning. But Luther Woolridge, who was 29 years old and living with relatives at Pigeon Hill, which was the kind of the ghetto area in Bloomington, if you're wondering, when the police showed up at the house and found that booth, if they had a search warrant, it wasn't important. The Supreme Court had ruled in a case called Weeks versus the United States way back in 1914 that if you seize evidence illegally, meaning without a warrant, then it could not be used in a trial. But that only applied to federal cases. This is murder. This is a state case. It has nothing to do with that. The Supreme Court did not rule till 1961 in Mapp versus Ohio, many years after our murder, that you had to have a warrant for a state crime. Well, turns out that Luther had a rap sheet, 6 previous arrests, 2 convictions. Age 17, petty larceny, served 16 months in the Indiana Boys School. And in 1936, public indecency, sodomy in Greencastle, and he served 2 months. He had 2 children, was married, although separated from his wife, who lived in Benton Harbor, Michigan, with her children. Now, the prosecutor of the time was Robert F. McRae, which is an interesting story because he did not campaign for office for the election in November 1945 because he was still in the military. His wife did all his campaigning, so he was elected while he wasn't even around. Bloomington was a Republican county. He had previous experience, though, as a deputy prosecutor, but he was obviously a rookie at being prosecutor. And he'd only been prosecutor since January, and here we are in March. Well, old Luther Woolridge was interrogated for 12 hours, starting on Sunday and lasting most of the night into Monday morning. So now it's Monday morning, March 4th, early, really early. And he was taken to Indianapolis for a lie detector test, which he agreed to take. And then he got around to confessing his crimes at 5:45 in the morning at the state police headquarters in Indianapolis. Now, I find all this kind of mind-boggling, that this is all night long, and let's give him a lie detector. Well, let's just take him up there now. Do they have a lie detector expert that's working at 5 o'clock in the morning? Now, this is important because after they had his confession, they did not bring him back to Bloomington to put in jail. They were afraid to. He stayed in the penitentiary at Pendleton because Jim Crow was alive and well in Monroe County in 1946. The book, Lynching in the Heartland by James Madison, tells the story of these 2 black boys that were lynched just for having raped a white woman. She was not killed, but in 1930 in Indiana there was a lynching. In 1946 there were 6 blacks that were lynched in the South. Blacks were not welcome in most stores in Bloomington at the time. Hardly any restaurants served blacks. Herman Wells was involved in getting that fixed in the late 1940s so that athletes could eat in restaurants in Bloomington. So the police were concerned because if you have a black man now who has confessed to killing a white couple, the potential for a lynch mob down at the jail was of genuine concern to them. There was one newspaper account. The headlines read, "Outraged citizens swarm jail as break comes in murder." Well, as is typical of so many newspaper headlines, the headline did not go with the story. The crowds that were accumulating in Bloomington were both at the jail and the newspaper office, and there was nothing threatening about them. They were wanting news. This was a very dramatic news story, and they wanted to be kept up. But you notice that he was not brought to the jail till March 25th, 3 weeks later. Every time he was brought down for some official reason, he was immediately taken back to the prison in Pendleton. And only by March 25th did the judge and the police decide, there's no real threat here, so is it all right with you if you stay in the jail? And he said, yeah, it's fine with me. Well, the elephant in the room in this case was she raped? At no time did any newspaper I consulted ever even use the word rape, except for one story in the Chicago Daily Tribune, where they quoted the prosecutor saying bruises were found in the body of Mrs. Coleman which are not accounted for by Woolridge's story and which might have resulted from an attempt at rape. I find that extremely irresponsible in his part, assuming he said it. At the time, 8 Bloomington ministers adopted a resolution calling on the citizens of Bloomington not to condemn the entire Bloomington Negro population because of Woolridge's confession. And here he is signing his confession alongside everybody who once again has to get in the picture. Well, this is here for comic relief. This is what the charges said. The charges read that Woolridge unlawfully, feloniously, and purposely, and with premeditated malice, did kill and murder one Phyllis Sarah Coleman, 32, by placing, binding, tying, twisting, fastening, and holding a certain piece of rope about the neck of the said Phyllis Sarah Coleman, and then and there unlawfully, feloniously, and with malice and forethought did choke, suffocate, throttle, and strangle the said Phyllis Sarah Coleman, from the effect of which choking, suffocating, throttling, and strangling, she, the said Phyllis Sarah Coleman, on the day aforesaid day, first day of March, did and then and there die. Don't you just love lawyers? But I will translate to this lay audience. He strangled her to death with a rope. Now, I apologize for reading some of this, but to me it's important. You get it exactly. His confession said that I stopped and was watching the couple when the man looked up and told me to scram. I stood on the spot for a short time, and then the man asked me if I knew him. I told him I did. This man lunged at me. I ducked, and at the same time I picked up a window sash weight and swung at the man and hit the man on the back of his head when he went past me. After I had tied the man's hands and feet, I felt his heart and noticed that he was dead. At this point, I was scared and didn't know what to do. I finally decided that since the man was dead, I would have to also dispose of the woman because she was a witness to the fight. I found a piece of rope lying on the floor of the building, and it was at this time that I decided that I would choke the woman to death. Now, we'll find out later references to the fact that this poor Luther was not the sharpest knife in the drawer. And if he'd have been thinking, but then who among us thinks after we've just killed somebody? He just killed the witness to his claim of self-defense. And then the last paragraph of his confession, which was quite long, I wouldn't have made this statement except for the kindness shown me by Sheriff Skirvin and Officer Ray Hinkle and Officer Rabin. Now, I found that laughable, and I think the readers in 1946 would have found it laughable. I don't think that they took the rubber hoses to him to get a confession. I don't think that at all. But I don't think that that he came up with his own volition, that paragraph. Now we get to where the newspaper said, or the account of the confession said, the confession reads in part. The confession then related a couple in an embrace. And that brings us to the titillating aspect of just what were they doing when he was watching them. Now, it seems pretty clear that Russell Kuntz was fully clothed. But the degree to which she was not, obviously she didn't have a girdle and she didn't have her slip on, but just what was going on is left to anybody's imagination. And the newspapers, to their credit, did not dwell on that nor speculate. Well, when it came time to start handling the legal aspects of the upcoming trial, the newspapers reported the prosecutor had noli prost the murder of Mr. Kuntz. Now, noli prosequi is a legal mechanism where the prosecutor announces to the world that this man who has been indicted for murder will not be tried. We're going to have nothing more to do with that. And it was a wise decision on his part, because any trial involving the murder of Russell Coons, self-defense would be the defense, and it might be problematical whether they could get a conviction, but why take the chance? Why bother? The murder of Phyllis Coleman, you have a confession of a cold-blooded murder. It's going to be a slam dunk. Well, an attorney, Cy Woolridge's, Luther's brother, got an Indianapolis attorney, Lawrence Shaw, a rather famous attorney. Whoops, let's get this back up. Wonder how you back up this. Here we go. He was born in Paris, came to the United States as a young man, graduated from IU Law School, prominent in Republican circles, had a term in the legislature, self-described as an attorney for the damned, because this is the kind of case that he liked to take for some. It's kind of a Clarence Darrow sort of attorney. Now, forget about the man confessing to killings. I want you to look at the headline above that. Newsman attacked by dead man's brother. Russell Coons' funeral was on Monday, and the newspaper ones, particularly from the Tribune, were determined to get a picture of Ruth. And the police said, no, you're not. The only pictures you can take will be off the church grounds, and you can only take them after the service is over when people are coming out. Okay. That wasn't good enough for Russell Coons' brothers, who attacked Ed Feeney, the Chicago Tribune, for trying to get a picture of Ruth. They damaged his camera in a scuffle, and Prosecutor McCrae warns Feeney to get out of town. Feeney says, I'll get out of town when I'm good and ready. And meanwhile, the attorneys, big city attorneys from Chicago, were down in Bedford, and they filed charges against the brothers of Russell Coons. And he was found guilty in the lesser court. I can't think of it. But anyway, they were fined $1 and court costs, and they had to pay $5 to get the camera fixed. So everybody was happy after that. Now, I do not know if this picture was taken as the tussle was going on with the photographer, or if the casket is being removed from the church. I don't know. But I do know that lady right there, once she found out her picture was being taken, was going to have her best side on the print and not having her back. Mrs. Coons' Phyllis Coleman, her funeral was on Tuesday. Same church, same preacher, probably the same crowd. But anyway, all of the legal things in Monroe County were handled by Circuit Court Judge Q. Austin East, who was a circuit court judge from 1945 to 1947. And Matthew Hill was the assistant prosecutor. That may not mean anything to you, but he followed Judge East as the Monroe County Circuit Court Judge from 1956 to 1980. I remember him. And here we are with Robert McCrae and his assistant, Matthew Hill. Well, the grand jury was sworn in on March 7th, and I told you that Woolridge was brought from Pendleton and returned there because the judge said we don't want any trouble, and neither did Luther. There's the grand jury.
Great pictures. Those great pictures.
Well, on September 11th, Judge East set trial for November 12th. And the trial was to be in Spencer in Owen County because Luther's lawyer got a change of venue. So it's going to be in Spencer County. in the circuit court of Judge Frank M. Martin, who died in 1957 after serving as judge since 1938 when that court was founded. Well, 3 days before his scheduled trial, he made the statement when he withdrew his plea of not guilty and changed it to guilty. Obviously, a plea bargain is going on here. And he said, quote, "I do not believe I am guilty of first-degree murder, but I'm doing this in consideration of my family, my people, and the people of the community." Well, remember me talking about he wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer? His lawyer made a big to-do when the confession was published, saying he is not educated enough to use words in that confession, implying that the confession was totally written by the police or the prosecutor or whatever. And then I find it ironical that we end up at this quote, which clearly was not written by Luther Woolridge. Meanwhile, the circuit court judge, he had in the newspaper a letter he had written that says, quote, "I earnestly request that no governor or commission ever pardon, parole, or commute for any reason a life sentence. It is my firm conviction that this man is entirely too dangerous an individual to ever be at large, and that he should never be permitted to be released from the Indiana State Prison, but should remain there during his entire life." Strong letter to follow. Attorney Lawrence Shaw, he went ballistic over this, and he swore that outside the agreement not made in open court, as part of the court records and beyond the jurisdiction of the judge at this time, he took exception to Judge Martin. Well, I consulted a retired federal magistrate judge, and I said, "What do you think of what Judge Martin did?" And he said, "Without question, today that would be considered against the rules of judicial conduct, and it will be regarded as unethical, certainly. Today, no question. 1946, and he did a little research, and he said, 1946, I think it would have been equally against the rules of judicial conduct." He thought the lawyer had a good point. But he pointed out something to me that I hadn't thought of, that I was embarrassed not to have thought of. Judge Martin, and being a circuit court judge, was an elected judge. And he saw that this letter was released to the newspapers in Owen County because he wanted the voters to know that he would have been delighted to send this man to the electric chair, but his hands were tied because of a plea bargain. At least that's my theory, and I think it makes good sense. Well, here we have Luther on his way to the prison, and we know that because that's what the caption said, but also because he had a shirt and tie and a coat on. And the only time he ever did was when he showed up in Judge Martin's court to plead guilty and be sentenced to a life in prison. And he lasted in prison until 1978, when Otis Bowen released him because of his age and medical problems. And it's interesting, he had been up for parole twice. And certainly the first time, the parole board used Judge Martin's letter as one of the reasons why they did not parole him. But then they could have been just looking for a reason that they could hang their hat on because they just weren't comfortable with paroling him. Who knows? Well, he died in 1981 and is buried in Crown Hill Cemetery in Indianapolis. Clearly, when Ruth Kuntz provided a headstone for Russell, she thought that's where she would wind up, but she remarried, and Ruth Kuntz remarried to Earl Stansfer. Earl Stansfer owned Stansfer Electric, or Stansfer Radio, for many years in Monroe County, and Phyllis, of course, is all by herself. And Mr. Coleman, he remarried and had a family. Now, you would think that any program that gets to the tombstone of the major players in the story would be at an end. Not so. In the words of the journalists, this story had legs. In the 1950s, well, from 1949 to 1957, NBC had an anthology show called The Big Story, in which they saluted newspaper reporters who had covered cases of less than Pulitzer Prize level, but nonetheless was well done journalism on an important case. And season 5, episode 31, Grady Bennett, the reporter for the Bloomington World Telegraph, which later became the Herald Telephone, he was saluted, and it was written by Norman Lessing, directed by Dick Schneider, and it starred Richard Carlisle as Grady Bennett. Well, Grady Bennett, Pall Mall cigarettes, remember those? They sponsored the show, and they gave out an award to each one of these journalists, the Pall Mall Award, but he got $500. And here's Richard Carlisle, who played him. Now, my computer skills won't allow me to access that episode, so I can't find, I never viewed it, so I don't know how closely it conformed to the actual story. So we'll have to go on. But Christine Friesel of the Monroe County Public Library saw that I got a copy of Detective World. That's not Christine. That's the front of the magazine. Anyway, inside it, there was a story of the choir singer and the peeping Tom by J. Filler. Now, J. Filler, in my opinion, is probably a pen name, because if I wrote as badly as he did, I would want a pen name too. Plus the fact that the name itself is a little suspicious. Filler. Anyway, his bad writing starts off in his first paragraph of the story. The girl's body was soft, voluptuous, with graceful lines. Her face had a bewitching beauty, outlined delicately by her gorgeous copper-colored hair. She lay back in the man's arms in the room of the old abandoned quarry and sighed. Change the hair color, and I dare say this would describe every woman who was murdered in a pulp fiction story magazine. Not to mention any witness to a crime, or a woman who hired a detective. Dorothy Parker wrote that men seldom make passes at girls who wear glasses. But she didn't go on to say, but it does protect them from being murdered in mystery stories. It gets worse. When the police uncover the bodies in the sludge pit, he writes, the three officers quickly pulled the boards away and stared down into the yawning pit. The sheriff said hoarsely, there they are, two bodies, a man and a woman, and they haven't many clothes on. Well, I annotated that article, which I wrote a manuscript about the mill murders. It's in the museum here. And when I got to that, I said, that sheriff, not only must have had a bad cold or was a heavy smoker because he spoke hoarsely, but more, he was a very astute observer and a very considerate man, because he wanted to point out to his two deputies what they could not possibly see on their own, that they were looking at two bodies, a man and a woman, and they haven't many clothes on. Now, in that story, which followed very closely to the real facts of the case, except for the part where they found the boot prints and the truck out somewhere near Bean Blossom, it had a whole different subplot about how that came to pass. And they got 11 people who in real life show up doing those same things in the story. Got everybody spelled right except for the prosecutor, which they got spelled incorrectly. Poor old Carl Burks. His 15 minutes of fame were over. He wasn't mentioned in the story. Thus are the glories of the world, or how fleeting are the glories of this world. But more importantly, Luther Woolridge doesn't appear in the story. And by the way, the fact that the murderer was a black man does not appear. Now, I found that surprising. I would have thought the nature of mystery magazines, you know, they want to be as dramatic and over the top as possible. So why would they leave out the fact he was black? That would create interest and tension and whatever in the article. But anyway, and then the final paragraph. 3 months later, Chester Woolridge was found guilty by a jury of first-degree murder and was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in the state penitentiary. Well, to begin with, we know it was a plea agreement. It wasn't a trial, but that's not important. Who's Chester Woolridge? That was his older brother who was totally innocent of anything. You talk about incompetent writing. Where's a libel lawyer when you need one? Well, what's my take on the whole thing? I was kind of summed up by the Indianapolis Recorder, which is a black newspaper, and its coverage of this was very accurate and very responsible. They said the respect for the law and order deeply rooted in the traditions of this university town has bravely withstood the stunning emotional impact of the twin slayings. So as I look back on it, it made me kind of proud of my Monroe County contemporaries. There were no riots. There were no lynch mobs. The community handled it very well. The newspaper coverage was very reliable and on the mark. Here we have a man who wasn't so often in that era. We do have a poor black man who has a confession beaten out. No, here is a man who confessed, who was genuinely guilty. Everything was done quite above board. And if you want to know more, although actually some of the details came later when I went on newspaper.com and found more information. But it's worth reading to read that whole story in Detective World magazine. It is a hoot. Well, everything I've talked to you about this case, it happened 80 years ago. And everybody involved in it are in the same situation as this program, which is to say that they've all come to the end.